This is Daniela Norris on O Books Presents podcast and interview series. We publish great books on the mind, body, spirit connection. And my guest today is John Nelson, author of the new novel, The Miracle of Anna. Hi, John.
I know it, to Daniela.
So, The Miracle of Anna, an awakened child. What is your book about?
Well, the book is about a child who, in a past life, had been a Hindu guru and a Rinpoche, a Tibetan Rinpoche, and who was born totally awakened. I mean, as an infant, she's aware of everything around her. She can, of course, communicate, but at some point early on, after her mother has become aware of this, not only through, she starts to talk with her telepathically as an infant, and that slowly evolves. And as she grows up, as she's growing up, she's like totally awakened. She understands her connection to spirit. In fact, her sleep time is involved with spiritual journeys. And eventually, as she grows a little older and she gains the aspect of speech, she's able to communicate better with her mother. But she's totally aware. And what I wanted to do with this novel is to show a child who can offset the influences that we all are subject to as children, that turns us from these spiritual adepts, natural spiritual adepts that we are, to these outward thinking ego selves. And she can resist that. In fact, she resists the educational process. Her mother's a teacher. Eventually she homeschools her to keep the sanctity of her being quiet. But she resists until her spirit is firmly imbued into the body to develop her mind. And this is one of the aspects of the story that has what you would call a thematic push. The thematic adjustment here is that we treat our children as blank slates on which to write on and develop their intellect and their mental intellect early on when they come in with this huge spiritual consciousness. And what I am saying in the book, and I'm showing with Anna, is that this consciousness needs to settle in before we adjust them to the world, our world, and the ego mind. And so Anna does resist that, and eventually, guided by her mother and her spirit guides, she starts to educate herself. Now, Anna is based partially on Anandamayi Imai, the Hindu saint, who was unschooled as a child, and who naturally came to her consciousness without too much interference. Rama Maharishi is the same way. As a child, he would have nothing to do with school. He roamed he was in ecstatic states. And this is what Anna is. And this is the challenge presented to her mother and to the world at large when she becomes known. So that is like an entree into what I wanted to say about the book. Do you have any other questions?
Yeah, how does one raise a conscious child in our world today? Everybody knows how difficult it is to have our own spiritual practices and live in today's world. How does one raise a conscious child?
That is the challenge facing Maggie Langford. What she discovers early on, I mean, even as a 2-week-old infant, Anna shivers with the electronic noise of TV, radio, cell phones. All of that has to be disconnected in her presence. And as she grows older, she's able to create an aura, an aura around her strong enough to deflect that energy as she goes out into the world. And what is funny is that, and there are a couple funny episodes where she comes encounter with cell phones or boom boxes, and they just turn off too close to her because her aura just shuts them off. So that becomes a challenge. the other challenge presented to her is that she's a vegan. Even as an infant, as being breastfed by her mother has to become a vegan because she cannot tolerate any meat products. So, and then, you know, as she grows older, the main challenge for her and her mother is when excuse me, not Annie, but when her mother, Maggie, discovers that she can heal by a touch. She and Amanda Ima had this disability as well. If somebody has a disease, an illness, an injury, she can heal them. And her spirit is one that she wants to heal whatever comes into her presence. But that becomes a problem. Not just her mother doesn't want people lining up the front door to get healed, but her spirit guide, as Yogananda talks about in his book, The Autobiography of a Yogi, has to consult their spirit. Sometimes, especially in children, childhood diseases, or even in adults, the disease performs a function for the evolvement of the soul. And once she's able to understand that concept, and once she's able to ask the soul, and in a couple cases, she's told to back off until later, and she does. In other cases, she's told it is free, and she does it obliquely so that the healing doesn't come back to her. But that becomes a challenge. And then the other challenge, the other challenge is she is able to transport her spirit to what I call an astral park, where she has exchanges with her spirit guide Joseph. At some point, she's able to whisk her mother spirit there with her so that her mother can get spiritual instruction as well from Joseph. And this sounds all very elevated, but it forms the crux of the dramatic climax of the book when Andy is homeschooling 5- and 6-year-olds, Hindu children, in their little town of San Luis Obispo, California. And there's a dispute over the Bhagavad Gita and its interpretation. And so, you know, Anna whisked the whole class there to this astral park, and Joseph is able to explain the problems that the class was having with the Bhagavad Gita and its in-depth portrayal of spirituality. And they come back into their bodies, overwhelmed a little bit. And of course, they go out and tell their parents, and this becomes a problem.
So, John, I know this is a novel and it's fiction. What is your background? Because this is fascinating.
Well, my background is I apparently came in, unfortunately, unlike Anna, I came in with my own set of problems. But early on, I seemed to instinctively understand spirit. I can remember at the age of 7 formulating my own concept of karma, understanding that what we did came back to us and that we did both in both ways. So I apparently had a strong connection to my spirit, and I've had a past life doing this. And the interesting thing is that when I was 17, interesting story, I was in a public library and a book fell on my head, and it was Yoga Meditation by an English author. So, you know, I'm living in middle America, and so I've never heard of this. And so I pick it up, I go to I sit down, I read it, and I said, this makes perfect sense. So I check out the book, eventually I buy it. And so at 17 or 18, I started doing yoga, and I started meditating. It all seemed very natural to me. And that yoga practice I have maintained for the last 50 years. I'm now in my early 70s, and I can't think of 200 days possibly in that period of time where I didn't do at least 20 or 30 minutes of yoga every day. So, yeah. And then, I wrote my first novel when I was like 14 years old. And then when I was 18 years old, I wrote my first full-length novel. And so I came to this naturally in terms of, and the books were spiritual. And my first novel was published in 1978 called Starborn. And Starborn is about a baby who this is similar to Anna a little bit, but it's more of a facetious take on reincarnation, comes in and forgets to cut off his memory bank, so he remembers all his connections to everybody and has all his psychic powers intact, and this becomes a problem for him. But this was an early take on this story, but it's done in a much more facetious light. So yeah, I went through school. I wasn't very impressed with it. Got out as early as I could, and then I just developed my consciousness through yoga, through meditation, and started working in spiritual publishing in my 30s and 40s after I'd published a couple novels. I was part of the team that acquired Conversations with God at Hampton Roads Publishing, and I worked there, and I worked at Barron Company as the editorial director at Barron Company. And what got me to Maui, Hawaii, was I became the editorial director of another spiritual publishing company, Inner Oceans. And I stayed here and started my own little editorial company where I edit books for people, and I also write my own.
So if we talk about spiritual fiction, or I've also heard the term being used, visionary fiction, is this what The Miracle of Anna is? And what is the difference between the two, if you can help us understand? It's not always clear.
Okay. My understanding of it is that spiritual fiction is Siddhartha by Hermann Hesse would be spiritual fiction. And that is pure spiritual fiction. I think there was a book written by Deepak Chopra about the Buddha, which would probably be spiritual fiction. Visionary fiction is a broader venue, and what happens, and it's aligned with speculative fiction. Now, speculative fiction is in visionary fiction, possibly unlike, although there are themes in spiritual fiction, visionary fiction is more speculative in the fact that the dramatic situations and characters represent a point of view that the author is trying to get across. It's almost like a blend between fiction and nonfiction. And Anna has a little of that, but I think I would classify Anna as spiritual fiction because it's so focused on her spirituality and keeping that pure, which is the case we all have in this world. And so I would classify that. Now, my novel I, Human, which I did with John Hunt Publishing, some people consider it science fiction. I would consider it visionary fiction because while it tackles some science fiction themes, and in the end, the character in the book, who, like everybody in his world 50 years from now, has neural implants and 200 IQs but are having emotional problems, actually gets healed of that situation, and in collusion with spiritual adepts, goes back into his world and helps change those parameters for the people receiving these. And so at the end, he becomes like a bodhisattva. But there's so much nonfiction emphasis in the book, I would call that visionary fiction. Does that clarify for you?
Yes, dear? I think it does. Thank you very much. It's something I've been wondering about for a while. And especially the connection between science fiction and spirituality. I think there's more and more of that in publishing today, and more people who are interested in reading about it. And I know you write a lot. I think you published 8 books. Yeah. You write in a lot of genres and about a lot of topics. And you write articles. One of them, so I've heard, is discussing avatars and do they walk amongst us? So it's not directly related to Anna, but can you talk about that?
No. Anna is an avatar. I clearly state that on the back of the book. And in fact, there was a wonderful, the publisher did a wonderful, the publicist in alignment with the publisher did a wonderful video trailer on that. And I'm sorry. I just would you put that question to me again? I got
Yes.
lost.
Do Avatar walk? Avatars
Among
walk
Us.
among us? Do they really?
Yeah. Well, the interesting thing is, and I posted that article on the website. I've gotten feedback of a variety of from a variety of people with points of view. This is an article that was published in March 1st in New Dawn magazine, and what I talk about is Avatar. The the term Avatar is descent into flesh. It's the descent of spirit into flesh, and that's the literal interpretation of the word avatar in Hindu, and so in Hindi, I should say. So, avatars. Now, what I did in this article is make it a bit more secular. I talk about the traditional avatars of Buddha, Muhammad, uh, uh, and some of the modern ones like Anandamayi Ma, I believe is an avatar, a female avatar. But what is interesting is I found some research by a Tibetan student of the arts, and he talks about the avataric energy is the energy of unification, and he says that that energy, yes, comes in through great avatars like the Buddha, who, in reaction a little bit to Hinduism, created his own form of spirituality that was minus some of the rituals of that particular religion. But he says it's a unification principle. And so in the article, I talk about, and he claims, and I agree with him, that Einstein was an avatar. He unified theory that helped us understand the unity of all that is. Uh, Abraham Lincoln was a kind of an avatar. He united a disparaged world. Gandhi was a kind of avatar. He brought his India into a modern world, and he removed it from the English Empire. So he talks about that. And what I say in the article is that avataric energy is the energy of unification. Now, in the article, I also talk about Babaji. They had a Khan Babaji recently, and I talk about him and his main theme. Interestingly enough, this was like in 1980s in Tibet, not Tibet, but northern India. His main theme was "I am harmony," and what he talked about. Interestingly enough, he took Christ's concept of being open to everybody, to extending it into the world and extending it to nature, and how we need to embrace nature, and how we need to treat that as we would treat another person. And so the avataric energy is alive in our world. And as say at the end of the article, that we all can be avatars of a sort if we quiet the mind and we allow that spiritual energy to come through us and to work in the world. The Tolle talks about this as well. He talks about stilling the mind, and people come to him and say, well, I want to do something important. I want to go out there and change the world. I want to make big changes. And Tolle's telling them, and he does that in his books, you see these interviews in his books, and he's telling them, sit still. Let that energy come through you, and it will do what it will do. You don't need to be the advocate of it. You just allow it to be quiet. You allow it to come out, and it will go out into the world, and it will do what it needs to do. So I hope that answered your question, dear.
That is fascinating. That is fascinating. And what I really find interesting is that you took this awakened child, which perhaps when people look at India and Tibet and cultures where perhaps awakened children are, I would not say the norm, but people talk about them and they're not something strange, but you set your story in California.
Yes, in fact, I had a review, an Amazon reviewer from Indonesia, who was actually grew up in America and went to school in America. He said, "Wow, what a concept! An enlightened child in California." Well, I said it in California because, first of all, the atmosphere and the energy there, if you've ever been to California, is so, especially in San Luis Obispo, which is a really beautiful little town with high spiritual vibrations. I mean, Krishnamurti was in Ojai, which is a little north of Los Angeles, for like 20 or 30 years. He lived there because the energy was high. So I wanted to set it there, and there was and the question, because her father, her father, who is not part of the picture, is a yogi who's an American yogi who lives and teaches in India, and Anna asked her mother, says, why don't we move to India? It seems like that would be a better place for the acceptance of me and who I am and what I can do. And her mother said, well, if you look over the last 20 or 30 years, there've been a lot of East Indian gurus who've come to America in order to help elevate the consciousness of the people here. And even though you've had past lives in India, the reason you're here is because that's your mission in this lifetime, possibly, which seems to answer the girl's question.
Well, that is indeed very interesting, because with everything that's happening in America and in Europe and in the Western world today, I think the story of a child with an awakened child or elevated consciousness could really be the answer to many of the things that are happening. And we're actually recording this interview on International Women's Day, which is really fitting, because your story is about a girl and a mother. The father is not in the picture, as you said. How does the mother on her own raise an awakened child, and what does it mean for you to have these two strong female characters?
My what the Jungians would call my anima and my spirit guide, who's female, likes it very much. But what happens with Maggie is very interesting, and I think what could happen if we would allow our children that spark of spirituality and not early on try to impose our own insanity on them or our ego mind on them. What happens with Maggie is that she becomes elevated. She becomes not enlightened, but being around Anna and her energies naturally evolves her. And she goes from becoming a school teacher to becoming a children's book author of spiritual fiction, spiritual children's books, mirrored somewhat on Anna and her own journey. And towards the end, Maggie is two-fisted, but the child Anna is of another order of intelligence, of another order of being, and she has to honor and respect that. And so the mothering gets a little reversed here, where Anna is mothering the highest aspect of her mother, while her mother is protecting her, so that process can happen. And I think that process could happen in every family with the spiritual consciousness, that they allow their children to be their guides in terms of allowing that spark to develop instead of, I had a friend who was spiritual. She sent her kid to genius school at 3. I said, what are you doing sending him to genius school at 3? And, as he grew up, it didn't bode well for him. What bode well for our children is they come in spiritual, and we need to allow them to develop that spirituality, and then they adapt. Now, it's interesting that a lot of spiritual adepts in India didn't get educated until they were like 10 or 12 years old. They either lived in rural areas where there wasn't much of an education. Nanda Mahima, back in 1890s and the early 1900s, was another case of Ramananda Krishna, what had nothing to do with school. So I think, the case here is that we need to allow these children and respect them, and not just treat them as blank slates, to write on. But Jean Piaget, the great Swiss psychologist, talking about mental development, and that it's stage specific, that you have to have different stages in your mental development. I think that applies also to our spiritual development. And I think one of the stages is, in which Anna does reluctantly move into, is once the spirit is imbued in the consciousness, does develop her mind, does develop her discernment. So she can go out in the world and she can communicate with people at another level. But this first stage is allowing that energy to get anchored in the child.
That's a beautiful story, and spiritual or visionary fiction, as you called it, The Miracle of Anna, An Awakened Child, a novel, but I sense that it's based in some truth. Thank you so much, John. How can people connect with you if they want to know more about your work and your book and get in touch? You have a website?
Yeah, I have a website. It's www.johnnelsonbookworks, BOOKWORKS.com. If you go there, on my front page, I have an app for Facebook. They can connect with me on Facebook as well, where there are lots of things about Anna and a lot of things on my Facebook account that you can that they can go to. I have yet to. I'm going to get my webmaster to do an Anna page so I can download some of these articles onto that, so people coming there. But both. So come to my website. I'm glad to have you come, and then from there you can go to Facebook and friend me, and we'll be one big happy family.
It's been wonderful speaking with you. Thank you so much, John.
Okay, thank you for having me.
This is Daniela Norris on O Books Presents podcast and interview series. We publish great books on the mind, body, spirit connection. And today, my guest was John Nelson, author of The Miracle of Anna. You can connect with John through his website, www.johnnelsonbookworks.com, and you can order his book from your favorite bookshop or online. Thank you so much for listening.